don't know. The Wilderness Speaker Series is put on in conjunction between the organization that I have the good fortune of running, the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, Wild Montana, and also the Northwest Montana Lookout Association. We've been doing this, Chuck, how long has this been going on as a partnership? Here's Chuck.
6 or 7 years.
Yeah, been really great. Last year we had to pivot to doing it virtual, but that was still a fun experiment and went well. But we're super excited to be back together. This year at the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, we're excited for a very big season. We have about 42 projects we'll be tackling in the Bob. We'll be addressing a little over 350 miles of trail maintenance and probably treating something north of 35 acres of noxious weeds. And we'll have our biggest staff ever with a lot of interns this year and 6 crew leaders. And we're ready to get after it. Our new weeds project coordinator just started this week, so we're ready for a big year. But we thank you all for coming out tonight and enjoying this. It is my pleasure to get to introduce tonight's guest, which I know we're all excited about getting to. Kallie Moore has been with the University of Montana Paleontology Center since 2008. And in 2007 started consulting with PBS Eons, which is a YouTube channel that explores the history of life on Earth. And so I think we're in for a great treat tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce the fossil librarian, Kallie Moore.
To be giving this talk tonight. This is like 3rd time's a charm. I've been approached to talk to this group for 3 years now, and I finally get to do it. So we are going to do a deep time tour through the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and I had originally planned to talk about 3 wilderness areas, but the Bob commanded more attention. So we are going to stick to the Bob tonight. All right, so let's just jump right in. All right, we're going to talk about like the geology and paleontology of Montana in general. Give you guys all kind of a baseline for the state, and then we'll focus in on the Bob. And if any of you are curious about this map, this is a geological map of the Bob minus a scapegoat. It was made in 1991. This is available online. I had this printed out at the library on campus. It was like 28 bucks, well spent. So if any of you are interested in it, let me know, and I can find the file for you. So here we're going to start off hot tonight. This is the International Chronostratigraphic Chart, aka the geologic time scale. This is the official version. This is the pro version of the geologic time scale, and there's a lot going on. But one thing I want to tell you about this is that it is a living document. So this is version 2022-2. So this is already the 2nd version of this year. So this changes as we get new technologies. We can update these time zones here if we have new technologies that have better refined dating techniques. We can also fill in some of these little golden spikes. So anytime that there is a boundary, and that is the boundary between some of these units, like the Maastrichtian and the, I can't read that one, but the other one above it. There is a place on Earth that is the designated type locality for that boundary. And whenever we find it, and it's published, and everybody's like, yeah, I'm okay with that, it gets a golden spike drove into it, like physical railroad spike drove right into that boundary line. So we've been filling these out for several years now. And you can see here we got a few missing down there. So this will constantly be updated as we find new layers. Now, this has changed quite a bit. This has changed since I was in college, although that keeps getting farther and farther away now. But the one that you might be familiar with is right here. So the Paleogene and Neogene used to be called the Tertiary. And so there's a big extinction event right here, and that's when all the dinosaurs die. Whoop, yay for us mammals. And it used to be called the KT boundary. Cretaceous in German means, well, the first part of Cretaceous means chalk, and in German that begins with a K, so we call it K for short instead of C. But the KT boundary was the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. Well, we broke that up and turned it into the Paleogene and Neogene. And so now you may hear people, when they talk about that extinction event, they call it the KPG boundary. And that's what happened, was we updated the map, and now everybody has to call it the KPG instead of the KT boundary. So in case you're wondering. Now this is way more than we need for this evening's talk. Ah, that's so much better. So much more fun to look at. So this is nice. So down here, for tonight's talk, the Proterozoic and the Archean is going to be the Precambrian. Easy peasy. We're not going to talk about either of them separately, just the Precambrian. From there, we'll go up into the Paleozoic. So this is the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and this is another change right here. The Mississippian and Pennsylvanian have now been named the Carboniferous. And then up to the Permian. So Paleozoic means old life, and you kind of see that. All this like trilobites, yay, shells. Some early armored fishes. This little guy is called Falcatus falcatus, and it's actually from here in Montana, which is cool. It's a shark. It's about 325 million years old. Then we'll go up into the Mesozoic after this gigantic extinction here. So that's the end Permian extinction event, the Great Dying, when like 96% of life on Earth perished in a very short period of time. So most of you probably are familiar with the Mesozoic, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. It's the age of reptiles. We get dinosaurs. Then, again, you can see the age on this because it's KT instead of KPG. We go into the Cenozoic, the age of mammals. So that's the Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, Holocene. We're in the Holocene. So that's us up here in this sweet truck with an ammonite in the back. So you can kind of get a sense of time here. So this goes all the way back to when the Earth first formed, 4.6 billion years ago, all the way up to now. All right, here's our pro version of Montana's geological map. So each one of these colors that you see on this map represents a different time period, a different age of rock. So out here, all this tan stuff, that's the Cenozoic stuff, so age of mammals. All the green stuff that you see on here, Mesozoic, age of reptiles. Then this little bit of blue stuff around here is the Paleozoic, the old life. All this mauve-colored stuff, I guess it's kind of mauve, I don't know. Anyways, that's all the Precambrian. So that's the belt rock for us, which we're going to talk about in great depth. But then I want to talk about kind of this fold thrust belt, because right up here, that's glacier. This is the bottom. It's right down there. And we're going to get into some faults, not personal faults, geological faults. So much better. Again, we'll bring it down for this talk. So this is the generalized map. So again, yellow, Cenozoic, green, Mesozoic, blue, Paleozoic, and then this map has them all broken up. But again, we're just worried about this brown stuff up here. They call it Proterozoic, but again, it's the Precambrian. Whoops, too far. All right, again, pro version of paleontology in Montana. So this is a really cool website. You can check this website out on your own. If you travel anywhere around the world, you can get on this website. It's called the Paleo Bio Database Navigator, and it has fossil occurrences. So this is not the end-all be-all of everything that's ever been found fossil-wise in the world, but it does have a pretty good record of fossils that have been published in a peer-reviewed journal, so like Journal of Paleontology, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology journal. So if it's been published, we can pull that information and put it into a map that looks like this. So each one of these circles represents an age and the amount of fossil occurrences. So the bigger the circle, the more stuff that's been found there. And if you zoom in, you get a lot more resolution, of course. But again, you can do this from anywhere. I backed out just so you could see all of Montana as a whole. I want to draw your attention to this number right here. Now, this does include a little bit of the Dakotas, Wyoming, and the Panhandle of Idaho, but there's 48,000 fossil occurrences just in this view right here. Now the colors are a little confusing, mainly because they have Cretaceous as green on here. So the Paleozoic is mostly represented by Carboniferous, and there's a couple little spots here and there. The rest of it's basically Cretaceous, and a little bit of the Cenozoic here and there. But again, let's go to something easy. So this is a really cool map by Ray Troll. He did the earlier geological timescale map as well, but you can kind of get a sense of what all those dots meant. So we've got all sorts of life. Ooh, where's my pointer? There it is. We've got all sorts of stuff. Of course, all the dinosaurs, boring. We got some swimming reptiles, some flying reptiles, but really here's the cool stuff. This is the Bear Gulch. I mentioned that earlier with Falcatus falcatus. This is Stephacanthus. This is Chimera. This was an amazing inland sea, well, kind of an inland sea about 325 million years ago, right here in Montana. It's our only Lagerstätten, which is a really awesome fossil locality. Yeah, not even the Hell Creek has that designation. So I would argue it is more important than the dinosaurs. I better watch my back saying that, but so this gives you kind of an idea of all the fossils that can be found in our state, all the ancient life that is available right here in Montana. So now, if we combine all that, we combine the geology, we combine the fossils, we can create a map that looks kind of like this. So I hooked up with a class called GIS Jam. And what they do during their semesters, they create maps for people. And luckily, I happened to ask the guy to make a map for me before this class started. So these two students here, Zoe and Wyatt, were essential to this project. They met with me handfuls of times to create these maps. So what you're seeing here is Bob Marshall, but there's geology under there, and then also the fossil occurrences. Again, so we put those on this map too. This largest circle has about 53 or 58 fossil occurrences, and it's towards the south end, or the western side in the Sawtooth Range. Now these are the other two I was going to talk about until I couldn't. The UL Bend, and I actually combined that with the Upper Missouri Breaks just to have more fossils to talk about. There's the same unit, only one place is a little bit bigger, but we won't be talking about it. And the other one is the Absaorca Beartooths, and again, we won't talk about it tonight, but maybe next time. So let's jump into the Bob. All right, so this talk is going to be about, like I called it Bob Senior earlier. This is the original Bob. This is not the Great Bear or the Scapegoat, although you can take this information and kind of extrapolate it from there. But this is Bob Senior that I want to talk about. I really like this quote I found by the actual guy, Bob Marshall. I love the woods and solitude. I should hate to spend the greater part of my lifetime in a stuffy office or in a crowded city. And I think a lot of us in this room could probably identify with that statement. So if you're unfamiliar with the Bob Marshall, I just wanted to throw this map up there. This map is from this book. I highly encourage it. This book, The Bob Marshall Country, it's got like 4 pages of geology, although it's kind of out of date now. This book is from 2007, I believe. But I took this out of there because it was the best simple map of the Bob, and it showed 2 areas that we're going to talk about most. And that is Pentagon Mountain up here in the north and the Chinese Wall down here in kind of south central. So to get your bearings for this talk, if you're unfamiliar with these areas. So here's this beautiful Bob Marshall map that I had the students create, and it's very simplified. As you can see, this is the pro version. This is the okay version for us tonight. So to walk you through it again, these pink colors here are the Precambrian. This brownish tone here is the Devonian and Cambrian. All of this green stuff is Cretaceous, and then the blue stuff over here is Paleozoic. Now, this is way simplified. It is so much more complex than this, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk all about it. But let's start at the beginning. The oldest rock that you can find in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and it comes from the Precambrian. And the Belt Purcell supergroup is our Precambrian rock in the Bob. And you can see, a lot of people talk about the Bob like it's just here in the Belt supergroup. They talk about it almost like it's just here, but you can see it's a massive unit. It goes all the way from upper Canada down into almost Wyoming is where it outcrops. And so this is a huge group. And of course, rocks know country boundaries, but people know country boundaries, and so we name it the Windermere group up here and the Purcell group down here. But it's all the Belt rock. It's all the same. It's all the same rock. Now it formed back around 1.4 to 1.5 billion years ago when this supercontinent, although it's not very big, but we call this a supercontinent because all of the Earth's land masses, no matter how small they were at this time, were all jumbled up together in one big continent. And as this supercontinent started to break apart a little bit, we get a basin that forms, but it's an inland basin. So if we look a little closer at what it would have looked like, So here's the Belt Basin. It was fed by rivers from the continental highlands, and it made the Belt Sea here. So this was a nice inland sea, fed by rivers, and sediment accumulated for about 70 million years. And throughout that 70 million years, we get a supergroup. If you go from the uppermost supergroup, where you can find it, to the lowermost supergroup, it's about 10 miles thick. That is a huge chunk of rock. That is a lot of rock. Here in Montana, it's not quite that thick, but we do have one of the best exposures of it in the Northwest. So what can you find in the belt? Well, it's 1.5 billion years old, so there's not a whole lot you can find in the way of life. Actually, all life at this time was microbial, so bacteria, cyanobacteria, in particular, stromatolites. A lot of stromatolites, worldwide, everywhere, dominant form of life, stromatolites. And these wonderful things, they're some of my favorite, I guess, they're sort of fossils, but they're also sedimentary structures, but they're one of my favorites. I look for them everywhere that I go. And they're made of sediment and cyanobacteria. So how this works is there's cyanobacteria, and it's photosynthetic, so it needs light. It takes in carbon dioxide, releases oxygen, but it also creates like a goo. And it lives in the tidal ranges, so sometimes it's exposed to the air and sometimes it's below water. And then when the water comes in, it brings sediment, little bits of sand and things like that. It gets trapped in the goo. And then the cyanobacteria is like, wait, who turned out the lights? Oh yeah, it was me, I need to grow above it. And so it grows above it. And it solidifies that sediment underneath it. And this happens incredibly slowly over, well, in this case, billions of years. Now, when you have worldwide dominating plant, it's not really a plant, it's kind of weird. Cyanobacteria is weird. It pumped out a ton of oxygen. And so we relate the birth of oxygen in our atmosphere basically to these guys, stromatolites. So for 2.5 billion years, they did nothing but pump oxygen out. And it finally built up into the atmosphere to about 1%, 2.5 billion years ago-ish, give or take a couple hundred million. And it created massive rusting. So if you've ever heard of banded iron formation, all of the world's banded iron formation formed about the same time. And it's all due to stromatolites building up oxygen in the atmosphere, which is absolutely incredible. I think it's incredible. But I really like stromatolites. So like I said, they grow in these shallow, clear, calm waters, and that's exactly what the belt was. It was a wonderful place for all these early life forms to live. Now this isn't a fossil, but you guys have probably all seen these. You can see ripple marks everywhere where there is belt rock, basically. This picture, though, is from the Indian Creek Trail towards the White River Pass. So this one's actually from the Bob. And you've got some good ripples up here, but if you notice, this almost looks like it's lined. Each one of those are very, very fine ripple marks across this rock. I've never quite seen the ripples this fine before. But it can happen when there's little to no currents in shallow water. And all of these are preserved because there was a lack of animals to churn up the sediment. So I always joke that the Precambrian was like this microbial heaven. Like it was just a real chill time. There was no like predator eat prey. There was none of that going on. Everything was just happy-go-lucky. So there were no animals digging down into the sediments yet. They weren't churning up sediments. They weren't destroying these beautiful ripple marks because there wasn't anything moving around. Everything was sedimentary. Yeah, it was pretty basic. Also, mud cracks. I'm sure you all have seen the mud cracks too in the Bob. This photo is from Glacier. I could not find a picture of mud cracks from the Bob, so if any of you have some in your library of photos that you would like to share with me, I would love that. I tried to find pictures and specimens from the Bob specifically, but I'll let you know when they're not from the Bob. So this is what happens when clay-rich sediment dries out, just like it happens today. You can see mud cracks all the time. And in this case, they formed and preserved over 1 billion years. So the belt also preserves raindrop impressions, which I think is absolutely phenomenal that you can just get raindrop impressions. So if you think about a big mud flat and then it rains and then it's covered up by the next tide, again, you have nothing bioturbating, that's what we call it, when animals go down into the sediment and churn stuff up. And also salt cast, where water evaporated and on a mud flat. So you get these little kind of square looking bumps on the rock. But again, I couldn't find any from the Bob, so just have to take your word for it. So now let's jump into the Paleozoic. So we get old life, and this starts about 542 million years ago, but we won't go that far back. So we're going to talk mostly about the later Cambrian, middle to late Cambrian, and this is what the Earth looked like back then. Now, we're like over here somewhere. We're close to the equator, so it's good times for us. Close to the equator. They've had some smaller land masses out here, and this big, huge honking chunk called Gondwana over here. Now, let me dig it up. So, in between the Precambrian and the Cambrian, we have what's known as a great unconformity. So there's about 1 billion years of rock just missing. It's just gone. And actually this great unconformity can be traced all over the world, and the great unconformity in the Grand Canyon is basically the same age as our great unconformity. So in the Bob and elsewhere, you have Precambrian rock and you have Cambrian rock sitting right on top of it, and there's nothing in between 1.5 billion and about 520 million. So it's a huge gap of time that's missing. It's probably due to erosion. It's actually kind of a big mystery in geology. We actually did an Eons episode about the one in the Grand Canyon, so we checked that one out. But so we had this great unconformity, and about, like I said, about 520 million years ago, the oceans rose back up and covered part of the continental shelf here and covered us in water, and so we got some rocks again. So if we zoom in, this figure over here is a little much, but it's the best one I can find, and it was very recently. It came out in 2021. Ignore all these circles. We don't need to know those circles. I just didn't want to Photoshop them out. It's going to take way too long. But here's our belt basin. So it's still hanging out, and the Bob is like right over here somewhere, right on the edge. So you kind of see where everything was at during this time. And here are our Cambrian units that you can find in the Bob Marshall. So the Flathead Sandstone is the oldest, and the Devil's Glen Dolomite is the youngest. Like I said, the Flathead Sandstone is about 520 million years, and then it probably goes up to about 500 million. I could not get a good date on the Devil's Glen Dolomite, which was kind of weird. I figured there'd be a really good one. But throughout the Paleozoic, the sea level rose and fell and rose and fell, and when it was high, we get deposition, and when it's low, we get erosion or no deposition, and so we don't get rocks from that ages. So we're going to talk about a couple of other unconformities. They're just not big enough to be great unconformities. Oh yes, I wanted to talk about the thickness of this whole Cambrian section right here. It goes from about, I didn't put the thinnest. Oops. Anyways, but it thickens to the west, and it gets about 710 meters thick at the far eastern side, or the western side. But I would be remiss if I did not talk about this guy when we're in the Cambrian. This is Charles Dice, and he was a professor at the University of Montana from 1929 to 1945. And between about 1930 and 1940, off and on a few years, he worked in northwestern Montana doing a ton of geologizing. I mean, a lot of geology. And he measured at least 17 stratigraphic sections, so that's going out and mapping the rock from the lowest to the highest point. And many of his sections were in the Bob, so he was kind of the foundation of Middle Cambrian research in the Bob Marshall and across the country, actually. I wish I could have met him. He took really great notes. Thank you, Charles Dice. And in 1933, he led a 42-day trip to the Lewis and Clark Range. This was the longest field trip that the university had taken thus far. We've obviously went way past that by now, but I mean, that's pretty cool, 1933. And this was without a vehicle. Also, he didn't get a vehicle until 1938. And even then, he could only drive it to about the boundary of where the Bob is, and then it had to pack mule in the rest of the way. So not a lot has changed for how you do research in the Bob. And then his 1936 4-week field trip was super rough. He came back 35 pounds lighter, so that was a tough field trip for him. It was so funny. I looked at a bunch of old newspapers for this, and nobody said why. Did he like lose all his food? Did a bear take all his food? Was it just like really, really hard work and he lost 35 pounds in sweat? Who knows? But it made the newspaper all across northwestern Montana. But this guy went out there and he came back 35 pounds lighter. It was big news. Big news. Now, I think I have enough time. Well, I don't know if I have enough time, but I'm going to tell it really quickly. In 1934, his Packer's horse fell over on him. It was real bad. And not on this guy. The horse fell over on the Packer. And he couldn't ride. It was bad. It was real bad. And so one of the crew members had to hike 16 miles round trip to the closest ranger station. So we went to the Holbrook Ranger Station. And so eight miles one way, 8 miles back, to telephone in that like, oh dang, you guys, we got problems. We need a medical assistance. So then he hikes back to where this guy was, stranded in the wilderness. And a plane from Missoula came up with a forest ranger and a doctor. And they went to the Holbrook Ranger Station thinking that the guy was going to be there. And he wasn't. And so they had to hike 8 miles in and then 8 miles back carrying the person. And they did that 16-mile round trip in 3.5 hours. It could have to be a record. At least that's what the paper said. Multiple papers said that. And then he had to get on a plane and fly 100 miles to Missoula. And he lived. And they credit this whole thing that he lived because they got him out as quickly as they did. Now, I believe the first time a plane ever went into the Bob was 1928. So this was like probably like the 5th time a plane had even been in the Bob was to rescue this guy. But Charles Dice also worked with the university president of the time, Charles Horace Clapp. So if you're familiar with the University of Montana, geology is in the Clapp building and everybody's like, what the heck is going on with this Clapp guy? Well, he was our only geological president at the university and he published a few papers with Charles Dice, and I also have his field notes, which is fun. So here's some of the fossils that you can find in and around the Bob. So, wrong button again. This little guy up here, I didn't want to put scale bars in because it makes the pictures look ugly, so I put down here, it's in millimeters, sorry. Millimeters are just easier. Most of these are pretty small, so again, 17 millimeters, that's like less than an inch basically. This is Pentagon Mountain, so this is from, but Pentagon Mountain is in the Trilobite Range, so if there was ever a place to go hunt for fossils, it would be the Trilobite Range and Pentagon Mountain. This one is from Haystack Mountain, this is the south end of the Chinese Wall. It's about 20 millimeters. This little guy is Agnostus. I love these. They're blind. They have no eyes. They probably lived in the deep sea where there's no light. You don't need eyes, and so they're totally blind. But again, it's from Pentagon Mountain. Then the other two down here on the edges, these are inarticulate brachiopods. They're very, very old brachiopods, and they are very tiny. So this one's only 5 millimeters, and this one's 7 millimeters. So this one's from Cliff Mountain, about the middle of the Chinese Wall, and then this is a little guy from the Prairie Reef Mountain. But we do have evidence that there were some much larger trilobites living during this time, but for whatever reason, we don't have whole bits and pieces of them. So this is Monitor Mountain. Again, this specimen across is 45 millimeters, so that's 4.5 centimeters. This one is from Haystack, again, south end of the Chinese Wall, and it is about 35 millimeters long. And these are just fragments, so the individual trilobites would have been much larger than this. And then El Rathina is 18 millimeters from Pentagon Mountain. So there's evidence of some much larger trilobites out there, but mountain building is not the best for preserving fossils. Okay, let's jump up into the Devonian. So we are missing some more rock here. We're missing the Silurian and the Ordovician. So there's another unconformity. It's just not great. And then the rocks, again, they thicken from the Devonian about 290 meters thick to about 460 meters thick at Lone Butte. So Lone Butte is the place to go if you want to study Devonian. But again, here we are. We're somewhere up here. It's very hard to tell. Oh, somewhere up here. We're still very, very close to the equator, and we're still covered by a wonderful, shallow continental shelf, sea over the continental shelf. There we go. So again, zooming in, and again, ignore the circles, we don't need that. But this line here is the equator. So you can kind of see we were real close, almost right on it actually, for the bob during this time. And the units is the Maywood, Jefferson, and Three Forks. Now, the Three Forks is about 307 horn corals. They look like a horn, but this is just the eroded top of the horn coral. This is Syringiopora. It's a type of sponge, I think. I think people argue over whether it's a sponge or a coral. And it's also from Monitor Mountain. And then this lovely sporiferid brachiopod. Sporiferid brachiopods are my favorite. They're very pretty, and I'm going to show you, I think I'm going to show you one in just a second. And this is from Pentagon Mountain. So Pentagon has a lot of units in it. You've already seen a couple of times. So it has Cambrian, Middle Cambrian, but it also has Carboniferous at the same place. I didn't show you that. Okay, so this is a relatively small, 50 millimeters across, that's 5 centimeters across this top. But there were some much larger ones. So here is a sporiferid, the biggest sporiferid, I think, in our collection. This is gigantic. I have never seen them this big. And this is from Basin Butte. And it was actually collected by Charles Dice's wife. And it's a real bummer back then because they never said the women's first names. So I don't know what her first name was. It's always just Mrs. Charles Dice. Like, even on the tag, they didn't even put her first name. So it drives me crazy. But, so what they would do when they would go out into the field, he'd be geologizing, he'd be going all over the place, mapping out all of his sediments, and whenever they came across a really good fossil locality where it was really productive, Mrs. Charles Dice would stay there, and she would collect the fossils, and then he would go off mapping and then come back and get her, and then they would move to the next place. So actually quite a bit, especially our Madison group fossils were collected by no-name Mrs. Dice. So we'll jump into the Mesozoic. So again, age of reptiles. We are missing quite a bit, actually, between the Mesozoic and the Carboniferous. So we don't have any late Carboniferous. There was some uplift. We don't have any Permian, and we don't have any Triassic. But even missing all three of those groups, still just a regular unconformity. Not great. Oh, we better talk about this. So the plates are kind of starting to look a little bit more like, okay, if I squint, I can see it. I can see it. So the bob, again, right up here, right on the edge, we are the western margin of the the North American plate. This is the western margin as we get. So this is right after Pangaea started to break up. So this is the remnants of Pangaea. So Pangaea was a supercontinent that went from the North Pole to the South Pole, and all the continents were grouped together in one big chunk. It looked kind of like a big sea. But it almost, as soon as it came together, it started to break apart at the very late Triassic, early Jurassic. So again, but it's starting to look, we're starting to finally look similar. And you can kind of see some stuff now. So if we zoom in on the Jurassic, this is the best publication ever. Again, ignore the circles, but here we are, right here. So we're still underwater, but we have to be underwater to get fossil, or to get deposition, basically. And our units, though, are very exciting. We have this Ellis group down here, and this is a marine unit. And then we have the Morrison Formation. So the Morrison is a really famous formation for dinosaurs. And I could not find, for the life of me, if any dinosaur remains had been found in the bob. So if you're looking for something to study, I highly encourage finding the Morrison and finding some dinosaurs in it. Let's see, the Ellis group is from about 170 to 157 million years, and then the Morrison Formation goes from about 155 to 148 million years. These are probably the two most common fossils you can find in the Jurassic. So this is from Yellowstone County. This one, though, is from Ford Creek. So this one is in the bob. This one is not, but I'm sure there's selenites. If there are Jurassic sediments that are marine, you're going to find these things. These are the internal structure of like a squid, kind of. So this would have been the front part of the squid. The tentacles would have been out back over here. And then this would have been inside the like head capsule of the squid. This is a certain type of oyster called Gryphea. They're also known as like devil's toenails or witch's toenails. You may have heard of them called that. But they're just oysters. They're not toenails. Nope, not at all. Just your plain old oysters. But they form massive beds, just like modern oysters do today. They did it in the past, so we have a lot of gravia. And I brought one with me that's way bigger than the one that's on the screen. I should have brought it up here to the podium. But in the Morrison Formation, what we've got, at least what I have in the collection, is not dinosaurs. It's plants. So this is all from Belt, Montana, so not from the Bob, but it is from the Morrison. So there's a chance that you could find these types of plants in the Bob as well. So we got some really pretty Saginopterus, Saginopterus, these are plants, I don't study plants. Ginkgoides, and so this is an ancient ginkgo. And then this Nelsonia is a fern, I think, or yes, probably fern. There's lots of ferns back then. So again, over here, it looks like a 4-leaf clover, but it is not. I keep hoping it is, but it's not. And then an old ginkgo, and then a fern. We have a huge collection of material from the Morrison, and I'm actually working on a project for a documentary over the Morrison. So, okay, let's talk about Cretaceous. So the Cretaceous takes up a lot of time, and we have a lot of Cretaceous in the Bob. And so I want to just show you how much it changes from early to late Cretaceous. So early, late, early, late. So a lot of change is happening. So again, these are the remnants of Pangea still spreading out. South America and Africa is starting to split apart. Once that opens, that'll be the Atlantic Ocean. Boom! We have an Atlantic Ocean now. But up here, this is the coolest thing, I think. This is the Western Interior Seaway. So this was during a really high sea level time. And the way that the plate was subducting, which we'll talk about in just a second, it pulled down the center of the continent and created this basin that slowly filled in. So like some states in middle America don't have dinosaurs, and that's because when dinosaurs were alive, it was underwater. So you get mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs, swimming reptiles, and things like that instead of dinosaurs. So I'm originally from Kansas, and that's what you find in Kansas. But huge chalk beds out here in Kansas. But for us, up here, we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in Montana. So here's the Cretaceous. All right. So this first map here, is from about 115 million years ago. Wait, is that right? Yes, that's right. 115 million years ago. And you can see, this is the very beginnings of the Western Interior Seaway. So this will connect down to the Gulf of Mexico someday. And the next map was not in that publication, so I had to use a publication about coprolites from the famous Karen Chin. So coprolites are fossilized species, and it was actually a really cool paper. But anyways, the Two Medicine is the top of our Cretaceous sediments, and so here is the Western Interior Seaway. And so this map is from about 77 million years, and by about 10 million years later, the whole seaway had drained away, and it was gone. So here's some Kootenai. So Kootenai is in early Cretaceous, so down here, first group. And these are all from Great Falls, not from the Bob, unfortunately. But again, a bunch of different types of ferns, and then a different species of ginkgo. So ginkgo is around and is live as well. There's a whole bunch of different species. Today we only have one species that has survived the test of time, but this is basically dinosaur food. These are two very common fossils from the Cretaceous sediments. So here is an ammonite. It's a type of Scaphides ammonite. And then this wonderful Baculites here in this really nice, this patterning that you see is the actual original shell patterning too, where the internal and external walls came together. But again, both of these are from Shelby, Montana. So the Front Range, I guess, so it's closer, I think, than Belt, Montana. But again, if you went out and you looked for Cretaceous fossils in the Bob, you will probably find them. Now, during the Mesozoic, this is going to be the deep part of geology. So we got to talk about some geology now because it's a lot. It's a lot. So during the Mesozoic, you had the initial uprise of the Rocky Mountains. And this whole thing is called the Seaver orogeny, but it goes for very long ways. We are not the only part of this. So here is a subduction zone. So you have one plate going down and one plate coming across. So this is the Farallon plate, the Pacific plate, Pacific floor, ocean floor plate, and this is the North American continental crust. And then the continental crust is coming forward, and it slams into this other plate. And because oceanic crust is denser, it starts to dive down underneath the continental crust. That it doesn't really float on top, but it kind of floats on top. And so whenever that happens, you start to crunch up the continental crust. And you get some real crazy stuff up here in northwestern Montana, these thin-skinned uplifts, which we'll talk about in just a second. But this all starts about 160 million years ago, and it continues on until about 50 million years ago in the Eocene. Now, before this uplift, all the units that I've been talking about, the Precambrian, Cambrian, Devonian, Carboniferous, they were all flat. There was no uplift. There were no mountains yet. So it looked like this. It was super easy. Easy peasy stratigraphy right here. And then the plates collided, and then you get this over here. So what happens is you get an overthrust belt. So older Precambrian and Paleozoic rocks were thrust eastward up and over younger Mesozoic rocks. So we have a rule, we have several rules in geology, but one of those rules is the law of superposition. And that means that the oldest rocks are deposited first, and the youngest rocks are deposited on top of them. And anytime that you find that that is not the case, something tectonic has happened. Something has shifted, something has moved, because you have to have the rocks there first before they can be shifted into all of this nonsense over here. So here's the belt rocks. They get shoved into all of these crazy fold and thrust belts. So this is the sawtooth range here. So this is Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and then it goes back to normal on the other side. So again, you're getting these older rocks shoved up on top of the younger rocks. So if we look at Montana, you can really see it in Glacier National Park. This is the Lewis overthrust, and that's where you have Precambrian rock shoved up on top directly onto Mesozoic rock. So the rocks in Glacier National Park, the tops of those mountains are Precambrian. The foot of those mountains are Mesozoic, which makes no sense unless you have some serious faulting going on. Here's the Sawtooth Range. That is the fold and thrust belt, which we're going to look at in a lot more detail in just a second. And so again, you have all of this Precambrian rock just being shoved and bulldozed into this younger rock, and it just crumples and buckles and folds and faults and does all sorts of craziness that I can only imagine how hard it was for the first geologists when they came across this. So here's another little schematic to kind of show you what is happening in the fold and thrust belt. So you have, there's your Cretaceous, Jurassic, this is Mississippian, Carboniferous, and Devonian. And so this is the oldest one. It gets shoved up first, and it's basically like shingles on a roof. So it gets shoved up, and then the next one gets shoved up, and then the next one gets shoved up, and the next one gets shoved up on top of it. And so they almost form vertical pages, like a book, as they get shoved up over the top of one another. So I think it's way easier to see in a picture though. So this is an aerial photo looking at the Sawtooth Range. So now you can see these peaks. All these peaks are that hard, resistant, carboniferous limestone that we were talking about. And then all the valleys are the soft, pliable Mesozoic shales mostly. And so this is way complicated, but you can see how complicated the geology here is. So again, you're getting these layers that are just peeling up because they have nowhere else to go. They can't go any farther east. They've been stopped basically way over by the Great Lakes. There's this thing called a craton, and it's the basement of our continent, basically. It is an unmovable force. And so these rocks got kind of shoved up until they couldn't go nowhere. And then they just started peeling up on top of themselves. So here's the Gibson Dam, here's the Gibson Dam. So you can kind of find your way around in this photo. So this is just classic overthrust here. So we've got The east-facing side, this is standing on Pentagon Mountain, looking north along the Trilobite Range. And so this is just a big old chunk of Carboniferous limestone that's been shoved up on top of some Mesozoic rock, and then there's actually Precambrian rock back here. So you have Precambrian rock setting on top of Paleozoic rock that's setting on top of Mesozoic rock, and that should be backwards. That should be the other way. Normally, you'd have it that way. So we gotta talk about the Chinese Wall now. So the Chinese Wall is another overthrust belt. So again, this long 12-mile unbroken ridge of limestone, it's all, I think it's almost all Cambrian limestone. I think there's a couple little spots of Devonian here. Yeah, there's a couple little spots of Devonian. But here is Cliff Mountain is on here. Cliff Mountain over here. Show you guys over here. Cliff Mountain. Haystack is down here. This is Haystack. So if you wanted to get your money's worth fossil collecting, although you cannot fossil collect in the Bob without a permit, very important, get your permit, yes. You cannot just go there. You can't take anything from the Bob, let alone the fossils. But if you want to do some science on the fossils, get yourself a permit. But I would say go either to the Chinese Wall or to the Trilobite Range for the most fossil for your buck, I guess. But now I just have a bunch of pretty pictures of the Chinese Wall because it's so pretty. So again, this is almost all Mississippian limestone, Carboniferous limestone. This is Red Butte. So this is towards the southern edge, and I think that's Cliff Mountain. I couldn't quite figure it out if that was actually Cliff Mountain or not. I don't know how much you can actually see from Red Mountain, but this is Cliff Mountain for sure. So it's really just a dramatic face of rock facing the east, and it's all limestone, and I guarantee that most of it has fossils in it. How good the fossils are, I don't know. All right, we are into, make sure I got this, yep, 12 miles, yep, okay, all right. So the Cenozoic is not well represented in the Bob at all, really at all. But the next big geological happenings occurred during the Cenozoic, and it happened during the Eocene. So around 50 million years ago, another generation of faults started. And this actually, instead of the rocks being smashed together, it actually started pulling the rocks apart. And that's because the western margin of our continent was getting bigger. And so the area of subduction was moved west. So that pressure on the Bob Marshall area was released, and everything starts to relax. So if you think of like a bulldozer bulldozing a big pile of dirt, and then it comes back, all that dirt just starts to spread back out again. Now the Eocene was super warm. It started out really warm, probably the warmest of the Cenozoic. It's called the PETM, the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum. And it was so hot that there were crocodiles living in the high Arctic. It's warm. Montana was covered in this lush deciduous forest, not coniferous forest. So we had like maples and ashes and oaks just everywhere. And probably some of the top fossils in Montana from the Eocene are petrified wood. And that's because we had these lush forests all over the place. But for us, we get extensional basins. So this is the relaxing. So the plates start to move opposite of one another. You get faults forming in the middle. And then this thins the crust and everything starts to kind of sink. And you get a little range, and you get a basin, and you get a range, and you get a basin. And then this will eventually fill in. But here's another kind of schematic of this. So as it shoves, one side usually collapses into the valley, and one side is shoved up, almost at the exact same time, as they spread out. So we get all these new basins that formed, so that includes the Kishinin Basin up in Glacier and the Flathead Basin, which is the south side of, or the west side of the Bob. So that's why we're talking about it, is because the Swan Valley was basically the Swan Range, that sheer western front of the Swan Range is one of these. This is actually called a half graben here. But so here's the mountains, and then here's the sheer face that hasn't quite filled in with sediment. But give it like 50 million years and the whole basin will be filled with sediment one of these days. But we know that this is still active. These are still active faults today. And one of the coolest things I was reading about is the Mission Fault. And it actually cuts through a layer of glacial Lake Missoula sediment that's about 10,000 years old, but it displaced it by 20 feet. And so that could only occur with a magnitude 7.5 earthquake. So it had to be more recent than 10,000 years ago, and it was a very big earthquake. So these are they're still shaking us a little bit today. This is the Kishinin Valley here. I can't remember which valley this one is. But then if you like fossils in Montana and you like mammal fossils, the Renova Formation might sound familiar. It's a big basin. But anyways, you find mammal fossils. But there's none in the bottom, so we're not talking about it. So here's the Swan Range. This kind of tells you, here's this big sheer face. This is the front that went up, and the valley is where it went down, where it dropped down as these plates are pulling apart. And so that's how we got the western edge of the bob. Now, these are from the Kishinin because I love it. I love the Kishinin a lot. So it's not from the bob, but it's from Glacier. But there is a 46 million year old locality that preserves insects. And these are the insects that you get out of this unit. And Dale Greenwald works on these, and I've met him at the Smithsonian, and these fossils are just magnificent. So this is the first mosquito found with a blood meal. So its abdomen is full of blood. Well, it's not like blood today, but it's got real high iron in it. So we figured that it's blood of something, probably a mammal. And then this wonderful spider, again, these are 46 million years old, and they look like you just smashed them yesterday. And then a crane fly. So I don't know if you could find anything like the Kishinin in or around the bob. These filled in one of those valleys. So you had one side go up and the valley go down, and as the valley filled in, it formed a lake. So water just flows into it. It's called a graben lake. They're pretty common. And that lake preserved all of these wonderful insects. And they, at the Smithsonian, have collected over 16,000 insects. But here's a robber fly. I mean, that looks like a robber fly. That looks like the robber flies I see hiking. And then this is a beetle. I think it's a love bug, too. But they're just wonderfully preserved, so I threw them in there because I love insects. I actually love insect fossils more than the real thing, but I just had to share that with you. So those are Eocene. So during the Eocene, that's when you get this extensional basin happening. Things are pulling apart. So we had some mountains already. Obviously, we have mountains, and the Pleistocene is the next. Time period that we're going to talk about. So this map. Hey, everything looks basically what it looks like today, except for all this. That's all ice. So this is during the last glacial maximum-ish, about 18,000 years ago. So this is like the most recent thing that has happened to the bob. This is the most recent geomorphological thing that has happened, the change on the surface of the rocks. So again, we're right here. We're right here, like literally right here right now. But the bob, right over here. And for our talk, we're going to be talking mostly about the Pinedale glaciation. So the Pinedale goes from about 30,000 to 12,000 years ago, and the max was about 19 to 15,000 years ago, so the farthest that it came down. So over here is a nice little diagram of this, because this lobe split around the swans, and so one went in between the swans and the bob, and the other one came down to Polson. So Polson is basically just a giant moraine. So as glaciers come down, they scrape the surface up just like a bulldozer, and then wherever they stop, their furthest extent, all that rock just stays there, and that's called a terminal moraine. So I'm gonna just, okay. So during this time, this is probably what the bob looked like. It looked a lot like Greenland. So this is Greenland, not the bob in the Pleistocene. It'd be cool if I had a picture from there. Just hop in my TARDIS and go take a picture. So only the tops of the mountains, the highest parts of the peaks would have actually been above the glacial ice sheet. And then the rest of this is all ice. So pretty bleak. But again, it formed the most recent surfaces that we see. So you can get these wonderful little cirques. We'll look at one in just a second. And here is your terminal moraine, so Polson basically. But it can form horns. So when you have ice on three sides, so like the Matterhorn, formed by ice. And then medial moraines as high as they went up on the side of the mountain. You get all these wonderful features, and these are the most recent surface features in the Bob. So I will close with this. This actually went way faster than I thought it was going to. This is a cirque. So this is where ice would have formed and then came out from there. So Dean Lake actually sits in a cirque. This is Pentagon Mountain in the winter times, which is appropriate for talking about the Pleistocene. So, with that, do you guys have any questions? Also, this talk would not have been possible without this book. So a lot of figures that I show in this talk came from this book. This is the newest edition of the Roadside Geology book, totally worth every penny. I was very sad to drive up here and not have somebody to read this to me as I drove up here today. But.
Questions for Kallie?
Yes.
Only an inquisitive bunch. Come on, that's a question.
I know we covered a lot. I mean, you guys got like a associate degree in geology tonight. Yeah.
I've heard that we are getting farther, like from Spokane to Seattle. We're still stretching. Is it true?
Yep, we're still stretching.
How much a year?
Not a lot. Like plate movement is about the same as your fingernails every year. So every year your fingernail might grow 4 centimeters. So it's pretty slow. So all these major changes happened over tens of millions of years. It wasn't just like boom, mountains. It took a while. It was a slow collision that folded and faulted everything. But yeah, we're still kind of spreading out from that initial Seaver orogeny.
I've read about it. I've never found it, but I've read about mayfly fossils along the North Fork. Are they, do you know if they're from the same time period as the insect fossils we were looking at?
So the question was, he's heard some mayfly fossils had been found on the North Fork flathead. It would not surprise me if there are some. So the flathead is also another version of that half graben. And so anytime you have a graben like that and there's water, it'll just flow in and it'll fill it up. There's no inlet or outlet really for those. And so very commonly, if you have a graben, you have a lake that forms at some point in time. So that would not surprise me if there is another lake basin up there in the flathead, or here in the flathead. And age-wise, all of this was taking place basically around the Eocene. I have theories myself because there's a lot of graben lakes as you go down, all the way down to near like the Ruby River Basin in Ennis. And they get younger as you go south. And so the farther south you go, well, that's my theory. So far, I have not published this, so don't quote me on it. But I feel like it goes older up there to younger. So it might be like 42 million years old instead of 46 million years old. But definitely, yeah, I bet there are.
Any other questions?
You can also ask me about not Bob-related stuff if you want. If you have a burning question about life on Earth. That's usually what I talk about.
What's it all mean, Kallie?
Yeah, I usually always talk about the evolution of life on Earth, and so this was actually a challenge. I had to flex a part of my brain that has not been used since undergrad to understand all the geology going on. Because I kind of ignore the geology. I'm just like, give me the fossils. I'll tell you everything you want to know about the fossils, but the rocks they were found in, so yeah, this worked a part of my brain that hadn't been worked in a while before. Yeah?
At what point did humans come into this?
Great question. So she asked, when did humans get here? I believe the oldest evidence of humans in Montana is about 12,000 years ago, but they had to have been here earlier, probably. So this is a big question in anthropology, mainly because earlier this year, late last year, earlier this year, we found human footprints that dated to 22,000, dated to 22,000 in New Mexico. So where did they come from? Did they come from south to north? And if they did, how did they get to South America first? If they came over on the Bering Land Bridge during the Pleistocene, which most people think they did, that's way before anybody thought they moved into this continent. So a long time. In this human evidence that we have is about 12,000 years old, but it's tough because if you're nomadic and you move around a lot, you don't have a stationary place to like build up your trash bin or to build a foundation to your whatever you're living in or something like that. And so if you're constantly moving around, it's really hard to find evidence of you. But I would assume earlier than we think. That whole area, I wish, how far can I go back? Oh, I don't have to go back very far. So you can kind of see it right here. There's a little corridor. And this corridor stayed open, I think, the entire Pleistocene, and it went all the way up to the Bering Land Bridge. So a little tiny corridor in between these two giant ice sheets. So this is the Cordilleran, and this is the Laurentide ice sheet. So that's where most people thought that, most researchers think that humans came from, is down this corridor and then spread out from there. But if you're finding footprints in New Mexico at 22,000 years, then people had to come through here at least by 25 or 30. So that's pushing it back quite a ways. Yeah?
How would they have gotten through the corridor if there's a lake right there?
Yeah, so these filled and drained often. So if you're familiar with Glacial Lake Missoula, yeah, those up here, clear, no, copy, where is Missoula? Left. Ah, Missoula. Too many maps. Okay, so Glacial Lake Missoula. So anytime this ice dam failed, it flooded everything. So I'm assuming the exact same thing happened with all of these. So there would have been periods of lots of water and then periods of little to no waters. Because it took probably, I don't know how long it took to fill up these glacial lakes.
500 years.
500 years, hey, thanks. About 500 years to fill the lake up and seconds to drain it. So yeah, they probably either stopped until the water was not there or moved through during a drainage time. I don't know. It's pretty crazy. That's a big question. Still. Yeah.
I'd heard some fascinating stories about Glacial Lake Missoula and its caving in, so to speak, and then rupturing across to the west and creating the channeled scablands. Do you have anything to share on that?
Oh, I wish I had the numbers. I think if I looked fast enough through this book, I could probably find the numbers. But it's ridiculous. It's like 100 Niagara Falls going off at the same moment, and so the amount of water and the speed of the water coming out of Glacial Lake Missoula would have been astronomical. But it was enough to create, well, what they look like is rolling hills, but they're not. They're ripple marks. They're giant ripple marks that you can really only see from like an aerial view. So in an airplane, you can really see them. And it's just a huge outwash plain where all that water just like channeled through the valleys and then spread out from there. But like I said, the numbers for Glacial Lake Missoula are hard to imagine, because especially the best time to look up the numbers for Glacial Lake Missoula is during high water in the spring. So you know how much outflow you're having on your normal rivers, and you're like, man, Clark Fork went up like so much, it's about to touch Madison Street footbridge, oh my goodness. And then you look at those flow rates, and then look at the flow rate of Glacial Lake Missoula, and it's like child's play. So I wish I had those numbers for you, but it is crazy. All that water went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It went all the way past Seattle into the ocean. So we can find the sediments all the way across there. But no fossils. It's really weird. I mean, it's not weird if you have this giant flood, it scours everything everywhere. But no fossils have been found associated with Glacial Lake Missoula, as far as I know. It's the last Glacial Lake Missoula talk. Yeah.
What are the significant differences between the Bob and the other two wildernesses?
Yeah. I don't know, because I didn't look into it. But I think the main difference is the age. And the reason why I chose those other two is because they were a little bit different than the bob. Oh my God, we gotta go like way back. Okay, here we go. So this pink color is Precambrian. So the Absaorca, I think that's how you say it. I'm so sorry. Absarca? Absarca. Okay. Absorki. Oh man. It's gonna be a fight.
Unless you watch Longmire,
It's like Choto or whatever they say on Jurassic Park when John Hammond comes. Totally butchers the name of Choto. Anyway, so over here it's basically all Mesozoic. All Mesozoic. And I was hoping that there'd be some dinosaurs to talk about over here. So this is UL Bend, and I just grouped it with the upper Missouri River Breaks. Then down here we have a little bit of, I was hoping for some more Cenozoic, but this is Paleozoic down here, or Cambrian or Devonian or something like that. But I was hoping to find, there's some pretty good mammal fossils down here. So I was hoping that somebody had found some good mammal fossils so that we could talk about the Cenozoic mammals. But that's why I chose these two. Also because they actually had fossil occurrences on them. Some of the other ones didn't. Yeah, so maybe another time. Yeah?
The fossils you're showing us pictures of, how painstaking of a process is that to excavate those? Is it like just chip away?
Oh, it's super easy. Most of these were collected just like already eroded out of the rock. That's the great thing about Paleozoic fossils, is that a lot of this just weathers out naturally from the limestone. So limestone is very easily etched with acid. And so all of our rain is a little acidic. So it constantly is wearing and tearing on the limestone. So most of these, there's zero prep that's been done. You can see some of these got popped out a little bit. There was probably a little bit of rock that was covering, this is called the pygidium of a trilobite, but I like to call it the trilobut. So they probably chipped away at a little bit of that rock there, but this probably was a slab. They just like picked it up and was like, oh hey, trilobite. Over here, there has been a little bit of prep going on around this inarticulate brachiopods. Both of these were featured in a thesis from, oh geez, 1933 or so. And so just a little bit of prep. But for the most part, this is what they look like right freshly out of the rock. Sometimes you get a chunk and like break it into smaller chunks and there'll be fossils in it. Or you just go down to where all the rock is eroding out. That's called an alluvial deposit, and just flip over rocks. It's very easy in comparison to like dinosaurs. Yeah, like the Morrison Formation can be like concrete. And it takes hours and hours and years to prep out a dinosaur from them. So this is, I enjoy Paleozoic fossil hunting a lot more than dinosaur fossil hunting.
Any last questions?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about elsewhere in the state, big cool mammal fossils?
Big cool mammal fossils. Yeah, let's talk about some big cool mammal fossils. I want to get back to, well, let's do this one. So down here near Drummond, real great spot for some big ones. So you get these weird brontotheres. So the reason why they split up tertiary into Paleogene and Neogene is because there's a very difference with the animals that you find in it. So in the Paleogene, if you look at it, you're like, okay, that looks like a mixture between like 3 different animals, but I can tell it's a mammal, but I don't know what it's related to. And then once you get into the Neogene, you're like, that's a camel, that's a rhino, that's a horse. And so there's a huge difference in what the animals look like, and that's why they split it up. So instead of just being all tertiary, it's Paleogene and Neogene. So down here, we get some of these big brontotheres and all these little oreodonts. So oreodonts are not alive anymore, and they left no living lineage, and they're very hard to describe. They were ruminants, so they had like the cow's stomach, but they had like multi-hooved, like they had a bunch of toes, and each one of the little toes had hooves on it. They kind of had sheep teeth. They're just bizarre. But they went from real tiny to real big, like cow size to dog size. A bunch of different species all over the place. And again, you can find those kind of around between Butte and Helena. I don't think you can see Dillon is a good spot, and then Drummond up here. I've done a lot of, not a lot of work, but I've assisted some paleontologists out off of Frontage Road in Drummond. Right, yes, Drummond is the one close to me. Dillon is the one farther away from me. And you find lots of little rodents and things like that. So the reason why these animals changed is because their environment changed. And so during the Paleogene, you had a very humid environment, like we were talking about. We had a big deciduous forest here. Crocodiles living in the Arctic, that sort of thing. It was very warm, it was very lush, it was very humid, very wet. Then you had a climatic change where it got cooler and drier, and that allowed grasslands to spread. And so all those old archaic animals died out because their forests vanished. And then you had all these new grazers evolve, so horses and camels and rhinos and proboscideans like mastodons and things like that. So they took off afterwards. Of course, up here closer to where the ice sheets were, you can find some mammoths. But yeah, we've got quite a bit of mammal fossils in the state.
Kallie, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thanks to this great partnership with Wild Montana, the Northwest Montana Lookout Association, the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. We all thank you. If you want to see tonight's presentation again, or any of the earlier wilderness speaker series, both the two from earlier this year and the past few years, they're all on our website at bmwf.org, so you can find all the previous talks. So thanks for coming, and be safe, get home.